The wind was a blade against Alara's cheek, honed on 1,000 miles of unforgiving prairie. It stole the warmth from her threadbare shawl and the hope from her heart, leaving behind an ache that settled deep in her bones. The wagon, her final link to a life that had crumbled to dust, lay with its rear axle shattered, a crippled beast surrendered to the encroaching snow. 3 days. It had been 3 days since he'd left her. His final words a curse swallowed by the same wind that now tormented her. He had taken the horse, the last of their money, and the final, fragile remnants of her belief in salvation. Now, there was only the vast, indifferent white of the Montana Territory and the gnawing hunger that felt like a living thing inside her. She was what the women in dusty town squares whispered about, the wild girl. It was a name branded on her for having eyes that saw too much and a spirit that refused to be neatly folded and put away. They said she was untamable, a creature of impulse and ill fortune. Perhaps they were right. She had trusted a charming smile and promises of a new beginning, and it had led her here, to a slow, freezing death in the middle of nowhere. Her fingers, stiff and numb inside thin gloves, fumbled with the clasp of a small wooden box. Inside, a tarnished silver locket was all that remained of her mother. The metal was cold as ice against her skin, a stark reminder of a warmth she could barely recall. A tear froze on her eyelash, a tiny, perfect crystal of despair. The world was fading to gray at the edges, the endless expanse of snow blurring into the heavy, bruised sky. It would be so easy to simply lie down, to let the snow become her final blanket. Then, a shape emerged from the swirling curtain of white. It was a rider, dark and solid against the blizzard's fury, moving with a purpose that seemed to defy the storm itself. As the figure drew closer, she saw it was a man on a powerful black horse, his shoulders broad beneath a heavy sheepskin coat, a rifle resting in the scabbard by his knee. He pulled the horse to a halt a few yards away, his presence a sudden, jarring intrusion into her solitary demise. He did not dismount immediately, but sat motionless, his gaze sweeping over her, the broken wagon, the bleakness of her situation. His face, shadowed by the brim of a stained felt hat, was a landscape of harsh lines and sun-weathered skin. His eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm. He was Silas Blackwood. She knew the name. The townsfolk spoke it in hushed tones. A recluse, a man who preferred the company of his cattle to that of people. His ranch set so far into the unforgiving hills it was practically a myth. They said he was as hard and cold as the land he worked. He finally swung down from the saddle, his movements economical and sure. He didn't speak, walking a slow circle around the wagon, his boots crunching in the snow. His eyes noted the splintered axle, the empty provision box, and finally her. His gaze wasn't pitying, nor was it cruel. It was appraising, like a rancher judging livestock, but with an unnerving depth that seemed to see right through her layers of fear and desperation to the flickering ember of defiance within. She clutched the locket tighter, her chin lifting instinctively. She would not be judged. Not by him. Not here. "Axel's shot," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like stones grinding together, yet it carried easily over the wind. It was the first human voice she had heard in days, and it startled her. She could only manage a nod, her throat tight and raw. He looked at her again, his eyes lingering on her chapped lips and the hollows beneath her cheekbones. "You'll be dead by morning." It was not a threat, but a simple, unvarnished statement of fact. The truth of it settled over her, heavier than any blanket of snow. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. She started, but the word caught in her throat. What could she say? That she had a right to live? That her husband had promised her a home? The words were meaningless out here. Silas Blackwood turned away from her and went to his horse, pulling a thick wool blanket from his saddle roll. He walked back and held it out to her. She stared at it, then at him, suspicion warring with the desperate, primal need for warmth. Men who offered kindness usually wanted something in return, something she no longer had to give. He seemed to read the hesitation in her eyes. A flicker of something, Impatience, perhaps, or a deep-seated weariness, crossed his features. "Take it," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Or don't. The wind won't care." Her hand trembled as she reached for it. The wool was coarse and smelled of horse, leather, and wood smoke. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever felt. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the immediate, life-giving warmth a shock to her system. He watched her for a moment longer, then strode back to his horse. For a terrifying second, she thought he was going to ride away, leaving her with nothing but a borrowed blanket for a tombstone. Instead, he led the animal closer, its warm breath misting in the frigid air. "My ranch is a half-day's ride. You can walk or you can ride behind me." He looked at the sky. Another storm is coming. There was no choice. To stay was to die. To go with this silent, formidable stranger was a gamble, but it was the only one she had left. Without a word, she stumbled through the snowdrift towards him. He offered a gloved hand, his grip firm and impersonal as he helped her up onto the horse's broad back. She settled behind the saddle, her hands hesitating before resting lightly on his waist for balance. His back was a wall of solid muscle beneath the thick coat. He clicked his tongue, and the horse began to move, turning away from the wreckage of her past and heading into the heart of the storm, into an unknown future held in the hands of a man who spoke in truths as harsh as the land itself. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of white, and all Alara knew was the rhythmic movement of the horse and the unyielding presence of the man in front of her. A lone, dark landmark in a world that had tried to erase her. The journey was a blur of biting wind and the hypnotic sway of the horse. Alara huddled into Silas's back, the blanket a fragile shield against the elements. She focused on the steady rise and fall of his shoulders, a rhythm that was the only constant in the disorienting whiteout. His silence was absolute, a vast, empty space she dared not try to fill. When they finally arrived, the ranch emerged from the storm not as a haven, but as a fortress. The log cabin and a long, low-slung barn were built of dark, weathered timber, looking as though they had been hewn from the very bones of the surrounding mountains. They were stark, functional structures, built to endure, not to charm, much like their owner. Inside the cabin, a stone fireplace dominated one wall, its embers glowing with latent heat. The space was small, meticulously clean, and Spartan. A simple table with 2 chairs, a bed built into one corner, a shelf of tinned goods, and another of worn books. There was no sign of a woman's touch, no curtains on the single window, no rug on the rough-hewn floorboards. It was the solitary domain of a man who needed little and expected less. Silas moved with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire until flames leaped and crackled, chasing the chill from the room. He gestured for her to sit in the chair closest to the hearth, and she obeyed, her limbs heavy and clumsy with cold. She watched as he ladled stew from a pot on the hob into a bowl. He set it on the table in front of her with a chunk of dark bread. He did not sit with her, instead turning to tend to his gear, removing his coat and hat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The stew was thick with meat and root vegetables and so hot it burned her tongue, but she barely noticed. She ate with a desperation that shamed her. The simple act of filling her stomach an overwhelming relief that brought tears to her eyes. She fought them back, fiercely. She would not show this man any more weakness. When she was finished, she looked up to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. He took the empty bowl without a word and placed it in a washbasin. He had his own meal standing by the counter, his back to her. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. He was a mystery she was too exhausted to solve. All she knew was that for the first time in days, she was warm and her stomach was full. He unrolled a pallet of furs and a thick blanket near the fire. "You'll sleep there," he stated, not asked. He then retired to his own bed in the corner, turning his back to her and pulling the covers up. Within minutes, the sound of his steady breathing filled the small cabin. Sleep did not come so easily for Alara. She lay wrapped in the furs, the firelight dancing on the rough log walls, and listened to the storm rage outside. It was a terrifying sound, but she was inside, safe from its fury. She was a stray brought in from the cold, and she did not know the rules of this house or the nature of the man who had offered her this temporary sanctuary. Every instinct screamed at her to remain wary, to remember the price of trust. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light outside the cabin's lone window. The storm passed, leaving the world encased in a pristine, blinding sheath of white. Silas rose before dawn each day, his routine immutable. He would tend to the fire, make coffee, and head out to the barn to care for his livestock. He never asked her to do anything, but Alara could not bear the idleness, the feeling of being a useless burden. She began tentatively at first. She washed their bowls, swept the floor, and ensured the fire never died down. He would return from his chores to find the cabin tidier than he had left it, a pot of coffee kept warm on the hob. He never commented, but she would sometimes catch him looking at the small changes, a brief, almost imperceptible pause in his relentless motion. One afternoon, she found a stack of potatoes and onions in a small root cellar beneath the floorboards. When he came in that evening, frozen through and weary, the smell of a proper soup, richer than the simple stew he made for himself, filled the air. He stopped just inside the door, his gaze going from the steaming pot to her face. She braced herself for a reprimand, for being told she had overstepped. Instead, he simply hung his coat on its peg and sat at the table. They ate in their usual silence, but it felt different. It was less a void and more a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of mutual existence. After the meal, as he was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, he spoke. The soup was good. The 3 words landed in the quiet room with the weight of a lengthy speech. It was the first hint of praise, the first crack in his stoic facade. A fragile tendril of trust began to unfurl within her. She learned to read him not by his words, but by his actions. The way he left a fresh pail of water for her inside the door on the coldest mornings so she wouldn't have to go to the pump. The day he returned from the barn and placed a worn, leather-bound copy of Moby Dick on the table near her chair without a word of explanation. She would spend the long afternoons reading, the complex tale of obsession a strange comfort. She was learning the language of his silence, a dialect of gestures and quiet considerations. And in his presence, she felt a strange sense of security she hadn't known even with the man who had promised her his name and his protection. Silas Blackwood asked nothing of her but that she exist, that she survive. And in that simple, unspoken expectation, Alara began to feel the first stirrings of her own strength returning. She was not just the wild girl who had been abandoned. She was a woman who was enduring. Spring arrived reluctantly, coaxing shy green shoots from the thawing earth. The oppressive silence of winter gave way to the chirping of birds and the gentle lowing of cattle. With the changing season, a change took root in Alara. The hollows in her cheeks filled out, and the haunted look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a steady, watchful calm. She worked alongside Silas now, not because he asked, but because she chose to. She learned to mend fences, her hands growing calloused and capable. She learned the distinct calls of his cattle and the rhythm of the ranch, a rhythm that was becoming her own. He taught her, not with lengthy explanations, but with patient demonstration, correcting her grip on a tool or pointing out a weak spot in a line of barbed wire with a simple gesture. In these shared tasks, under the vast, open sky, a quiet companionship bloomed. They rarely spoke of anything personal, their conversation confined to the practicalities of their life. The weather, a newborn calf, the dwindling supply of flour. Yet, in the space between words, something deeper was being built. One afternoon, as they were repairing the roof of the barn, a rider appeared on the horizon, moving with an unwelcome urgency. As he drew closer, a cold knot of dread tightened in Alara's stomach. It was Jedediah Thorne, a man from the town whose piety was as thin as his smile. Before her ill-fated marriage, Thorne had made his intentions toward her clear, his proposals cloaked in scripture but driven by a possessive greed. Her refusal had wounded his pride, and he had been one of the first to whisper the wild girl label after her. He rode into the yard with 2 other men, their expressions a mixture of smugness and contempt. "Blackwood," Thorn called out, his voice oily and loud in the quiet air. He dismounted, his eyes immediately finding Alara on the barn roof, and his lips curled into a sneer. "I heard you'd taken in some stray charity. Didn't realize you were running a sanctuary for women of ill repute." Silas didn't move from his position on the roof, his hammer still in hand. He looked down at Thorn, his face impassive, but Alara, who had learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. "This is private property, Thorn. State your business or leave." "My business is the moral decency of this county," Thorn declared, puffing out his chest. "You're harboring a runaway, a woman of loose character who abandoned her lawful husband. It ain't right. The good people of this territory won't stand for it." He directed his next words to Alara, his voice dripping with venom. "Did you think you could hide out here forever, you shameless harlot? Your husband passed through town last month. Told us all how you drove him away with your wild ways and wicked tongue. The lie was so bald, so cruel. It stole the air from Alara's lungs." The men with Thorn snickered. For a moment, the old fear returned, the familiar shame that had been her companion for so long. She felt herself shrink, wanting to become invisible. She glanced at Silas, expecting to see doubt or disgust in his eyes. Instead, she saw only a flat, cold anger directed entirely at the men below. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't looked at her for confirmation. He simply believed her. That silent, unwavering support was like a steel rod pressed against her spine. Something inside her shifted. The ember of defiance that Silas had seen on that first day roared into a flame. She would not be this man's victim. Not anymore. Slowly, she climbed down the ladder, her movements deliberate. She walked across the yard until she stood a few feet from Jedediah Thorn, forcing him to look her in the eye. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, and she brushed it away, her hand steady. "My husband," she said, her voice low but carrying with a newfound strength, "is a thief and a coward who left me to die in a blizzard after he stole everything I owned. You call that lawful? You speak of decency, Mr. Thorn, but you know nothing of it. You see a woman alone and you see an opportunity for cruelty. You hide your rotten heart behind a prayer book, but God is not mocked by men like you." Thorn's face purpled with rage. "You insolent girl. You'll learn to hold your tongue." He took a step toward her, his hand raised. Before his hand could move another inch, Silas was there. He had moved off the roof with a silent speed that was startling. He didn't touch Thorn. He simply placed himself between the man and Alara, a silent, immovable wall. His presence was more menacing than any shouted threat. "You will not touch her," Silas said, his voice a deadly quiet rumble. "You will get on your horse, and you will leave my land. Now!" One of Thorn's men, emboldened by their numbers, reached for the pistol at his hip. "There's 3 of us, Blackwood." Silas's eyes, cold as river stones, shifted to the man. "I can count," he said softly. The fight was over before it began. There was a certainty in Silas's stance, a promise of swift, decisive violence that Thorn and his cronies instantly recognized. They were bullies, not fighters. Muttering threats and curses, they backed away, clambered onto their horses, and rode off, their bravado dissolving into a cloud of dust. The silence they left behind was profound. The world seemed to hold its breath. Alara stood in the middle of the yard, her heart pounding, the echo of her own voice still ringing in her ears. She had spoken. She had stood her ground. She had not broken. She looked at Silas, who was watching her, his expression intense. He hadn't fought her battle for her. He had simply stood with her, letting her find her own strength, ready to catch her if she fell. He reached out, his callous thumb gently brushing a speck of dust from her cheek. The simple, fleeting touch was more intimate than any kiss. "You did well," he said. It was all he needed to say. In that moment, the last of the ice around her heart finally melted away. This was not a sanctuary. It was a home. That evening, The air in the small cabin felt different, charged with the aftermath of the confrontation. The familiar silence was no longer a space of caution, but one of deep, settled comfort. They sat at the table after their meal, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The tinny lamp on the table threw a warm, golden glow on Silas's weathered face, softening the harsh lines and revealing a quiet contemplation in his eyes. Alara traced the rim of her empty cup with her finger, the words she had held back for so long finally rising to the surface. She did not tell him her story as a plea for sympathy or as a confession of shame, but as a simple recounting of facts, a way of laying the past to rest. She spoke of her marriage, of the promises that had turned to lies, and of the slow, painful erosion of her spirit. She spoke of the abandonment, not with tears, but with a clear-eyed finality. She was closing a chapter, not reliving its pain. Silas listened without interruption. His gaze never left her face, his stillness a testament to his focus. He didn't offer hollow words of comfort or useless expressions of anger on her behalf. He simply listened, granting her the dignity of being heard, of having her truth accepted without question. When she finished, a quiet peace settled over her. The burden of her past, once a crushing weight, now felt like a story that belonged to someone else, a ghost she had finally exorcised. Silas reached across the small table, his large, work-roughened hand covering hers. His touch was warm and firm, a grounding anchor in the quiet room. "He was a fool," he said, his voice low and certain. He looked around the cabin, at the sturdy log walls, at the fire burning brightly in the hearth, and then his eyes met hers again. "This is your home now, Alara. If you want it." Her name. He had never used her name before. Hearing it in his voice, spoken with such simple, profound gravity, was like hearing it for the first time. It was not the name of the wild girl or the abandoned wife. It was her own. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaped her lips. A single tear, not of sorrow but of overwhelming gratitude, slipped down her cheek. "I want it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. The promise had been made and accepted. Later, as she lay on her pallet by the fire, she did not feel like a guest or a stray. She felt a sense of belonging so deep it was almost painful. This harsh, beautiful land and this quiet, steadfast man had saved her, not by taming her, but by giving her the space to save herself. The next morning, she rose with him before dawn. They stood on the porch together, mugs of hot coffee warming their hands, and watched the sun begin its slow ascent, painting the eastern sky in hues of soft pink and brilliant orange. The vast landscape, which had once seemed so terrifying and empty, now stretched before her filled with promise. The snow-capped mountains in the distance were not a barrier, but a bastion. The wide open plains were not a void, but a canvas upon which a new life could be written. She was no longer running from a past that haunted her. She was standing firm on ground she had earned, facing a future she would choose. Silas stood beside her, a silent, comforting presence. He was not a man of grand declarations or poetic flourishes. His love was in the solid roof over her head, the warm fire in the hearth, the unwavering belief in his eyes. He had claimed nothing. He had simply made room for her, and in doing so had given her everything. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the mountains, bathing the ranch in a clean, hopeful light, he reached over and gently took her hand in his. His fingers intertwined with hers, a simple, unspoken vow. The wild girl was home,